said the doctor cheerfully as he left. The home of the little family was a pleasant place near the park in New York City. In the mornings, the sun streamed in through the east window, and all the littles were up early as a general rule. Stuart was a great help to his parents and his older brother George. Because of his small size, because he could do things that a mouse could do, and was agreeable about doing them. One day, when the little Mrs. Little was washing out the tub after Mr. Little had taken a bath, she lost her ring, and was horrified to discover that it had fallen down the drain. "What had I better do?" she cried before trying to keep the tears back. "If I were you," said George, "I should bend a hairpin in the shape of a fishhook and tie it onto a piece of string and try to fish the ring out with it." So Mrs. Little found a piece of string and a hairpin, and for about half an hour she fished for the ring. But it was so dark down the drain, and the hook always seemed to catch on something before she could get it down to where the ring was. "What luck?" inquired Mr. Little, coming into the bathroom. "No luck at all," said Mrs. Little. "The ring is so far down I can't fish it up." "Why don't we send Stuart down after it?" suggested Mr. Little. "How about it, Stuart? Would you like to try?" "Yes, I would," Stuart replied, "but I think I'd better get into my old pants. I imagine it's wet down there." It's all of that," said George, who was a little trifle annoyed that his hook idea hadn't worked. So Stuart slipped into his old pants and prepared to go down the drain after the ring. He decided to carry the string along with him, leaving one end in charge of his father. "When I jerk 3 times on the string, pull me up," he said, and while Mr. Little knelt in the tub, Stuart slid easily down the drain and was lost to view. In a minute or so, there were 3 quick jerks on the string, and Mr. Little carefully hauled it up. There at the end was Stuart with the ring safely around his neck. "Oh, my brave little son," said Mrs. Little proudly as she kissed Stuart and thanked him. "How was it down there?" asked Mr. Little, who was always curious to know about places he had never been to. "It was all right," said Stuart, "but the truth was the drain had made him very slimy, and it was necessary for him to take a bath and sprinkle himself with a bit of his mother's velvet water. Before he felt himself again, everyone in the family thought he had been awfully good about the whole thing." We will be back after this quick commercial break. I already messed up. Welcome back, my fellow readers. As you all know, we are doing Stuart Little this week, so I'm going to give you a few more facts about E.B. White. E.B. White had won the 1953 Newbery Medal for Charlotte's Web, the 1960 American Academies of Arts and Letters Gold Medal, the 1963 Presidential Medal for Freedom, the 1970 Lurar Ingalls Waters Award, the 1971 National Medal Award, the 1977 L.L. Winship/Penn New England Award for Letters of E.B. White, and the 1978 Pulitzer Prize Special Action for Letters. So this is E.B. White's Stuart Little. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran in and got his hammer with screwdriver and an ice pick. I'll have this old floor up in double quick time, he said, inserting the screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good, vigorous pry. We will not rip up this floor till we have had a good search, announced Mr. Little. That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it. Oh, all right, said George. I see that no one in this house cares anything about Stuart but me. Mrs. Little began to cry. My poor dear little son, she said. I know he'll get wedged somewhere. Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that isn't a perfectly suitable place for Stuart, said Mr. Little. Just don't get yourself all worked up. Maybe we ought to lower some food for him, suggested George. That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave. George darted into the kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. We can pour some of this in, and it will run down to where he is. George spooned a bit of the applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. Stop it, bellowed Mr. Little. George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put that applesauce away immediately. Mr. Little glared furiously at George. I was trying to help my own brother, said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. Let's all call to Stuart, suggested Mrs. Little. It is quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about and that he has lost his way. Very well, said Mr. Little. I will count 3, then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for an answer. He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. Then they all called, Stuart! And they all kept perfectly silent for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yell in the pantry and called back, Here I am. But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. Again, said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3. Stuart! It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up to the Bureau of Missing Persons. But when the man asked for a description of Stuart, he was told that he was only 2 inches high. He hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. He moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other. In order to get at the section of the wall which he thought was likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and becoming interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came, everyone had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to a lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared, but was a sad meal, with each one trying not to stare at the small empty chair, which Stuart always occupied right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Miss Little broke out crying again and said that she thought Stuart must be dead. Nonsense, nonsense, growled Mr. Little. If he is dead, said George, we ought to pull down the shades all through the house. And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. George, shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone. If you don't stop acting like in an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness. But George had already run into the living room and had begun to darken it. To show his respect for the dead, he pulled a cord and out dropped Stuart onto the windowsill. Well, for the love of Pete, said George, look who's here, Mom. It's about time someone pulled down the shades, remarked Stuart. That's all I can say. He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it had happened. It was simply an accident that might happen to anyone, said Stuart. As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance of the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions. One morning, when the wind was from the west, Stuart put on his sailor suit and his sailor hat, took his spyglass down from the shelf, and set out for a walk, full of joy of his life and the fear of dogs. With a rolling gait, he sauntered along toward Fifth Avenue, keeping a sharp lookout. Whenever he spied a dog through his glass, Stuart would hurry to the nearest doorman, climb the trouser leg, and hide in the tails of the uniform. And once, when no doorman was handy, he had to crawl into a yesterday's paper and roll himself up in the second section till danger was past. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, there were several people waiting for the uptown bus, and Stuart joined them. No one noticed him because he wasn't tall enough to be noticed. I'm not tall enough to be noticed, thought Stuart, yet I'm tall enough to wait to go 72nd Street. When the bus came into view, all the men waved their canes and briefcases at the driver, and Stuart waved his spyglass. Then, knowing that the step of the bus would be too high for him, Stuart seized hold of the cuff of a gentleman's pants and was swung aboard without any trouble or inconvenience whatsoever. Stuart never paid any fare on buses because he wasn't big enough to carry an ordinary dime. The only time he had ever attempted to carry a dime, he had rolled the coin along with a hoop while he raced along beside it, but had gone away from him on a hill and had been snatched up by an old woman with no teeth. After that experience, Stuart contented himself